epidemic and refusal to continue the war, the Russian army is on the verge of collapse. The rate of recruiting contract soldiers in Russia has dropped to a 2-year low. Only 38,000 in 3 months. A mass epidemic among soldiers and complete demoralization are turning the Russian army into a force incapable of fighting. Money can no longer save the Kremlin from disaster. More details in the following report.
Russians do not want to sign contracts with the occupying army. In the second quarter of 2025, the number of people who signed contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense was the lowest in the past 2 years.
The very political structure, the mythology for Russians themselves has changed. But this is absolutely and undeniably logical because for several decades, the Russian populace was consistently fed the pervasive idea that their entire lives and societal structures were meticulously built around actively opposing the decaying Western world and above all the powerful United States of America. This meant that the entire geopolitical structure of Vladimir Putin's regime was fundamentally based on a direct and unwavering confrontation with the United States of America. And now here Putin is happily flying to the States, meeting with President Trump, announcing that they have plenty to talk about, including the Arctic, possibly rare earth elements, issues of nuclear deterrence, and so on and so forth. And right before the eyes of, as Putin calls them, ordinary Russians, Russian propaganda makes a 180-degree turn.
The Russian publication Important News writes that the number of contract soldiers has decreased 2.5 times compared to this time last year.
They're not just going to fight and potentially die in Ukraine for, let's say, mere signing bonuses. They are fighting for their homeland and their future. Their wives and mothers are happy when they receive death benefits. Well, we've all seen those incredibly heartwarming videos where a loving mother, by default, was genuinely happy and filled with joy. These are truly horrific scenes. That's it. But at the very same time, many people are also going to actively fight against this, precisely because that is how pervasive propaganda has effectively fed and thoroughly raised them.
Despite the decrease in the number of signed contracts, the Kremlin continues to lie about the real rate of replenishment of the Russian army. For example, Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council Dmitry Medvedev claimed that in the first 6 months of 2025, supposedly 210,000 new contracts were signed. This figure is 1.6 times higher than the numbers derived from Russian budget expenditure data analyzed by journalists.
It should be particularly noted that, according to the SVR, approximately a quarter of this total number is precisely what is referred to in Russia as the so-called special contingent among contract soldiers, a designation that carries specific implications. Who is included in this group? These are convicts, people who, for example, are accused of crimes and have made deals with the investigation. And in this concept of the special contingent, the Russians also include the forced mobilization of citizens of other countries under various pretexts and with different motivations. Some are first promised jobs at military enterprises with lucrative contracts, while others, like in certain Central Asian countries, are immediately offered large sums of money, and people fall for it, so to speak. Plus, they are also promised Russian citizenship, and some are even promised housing.
Despite the decline in mobilization morale, it is still difficult for the Russians to compensate for their losses at the front, but they are managing to do so for now.
For Putin, by and large, it doesn't matter who is sent into the furnace of war to achieve his political goals and ambitions, whether they are, as he calls them, ordinary Russians, or just some migrant workers, or people who are simply deceived and forced to put on a uniform and sent somewhere near Pokrovsk to storm through the forest.
Previously, the Russian Federation was able to maintain a positive balance both through Russian contract soldiers and through the so-called special contingent, which made up to a third of all new recruits. After Putin's rapprochement with the United States, against whom the Russians are supposedly fighting in Ukraine, the propaganda paradigms in people's minds are beginning to dissipate. Not even the high signing bonuses paid for joining the ranks of the Russian army can stop this. It's not just the Ukrainian armed forces that are helping to destroy the occupier in this war, but also HIV. The disease is cutting down Russian soldiers, but this is not mentioned on federal channels.
I didn't pass the military medical commission on purpose because I have HIV. I got hepatitis and my left kidney doesn't work, it's failing. What should I do? Help all of us. Here, no one has any dreams. The only thing is, tomorrow I'm being sent to the front line.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the number of HIV infections among Russian soldiers has increased by 2,000%.
I passed the medical commission at my city's military enlistment office. So it turns out they all got stuck. After that, at the regional military enlistment office in Nizhny Novgorod, I myself...
I didn't go through the medical commission, I just wrote the papers.
What is the reason for this sharp increase? First of all, it's due to unprotected sexual contact among Russian soldiers and drug use. Secondly, syringes tend to run out very quickly, especially during war. That's why medical staff in field hospitals often reuse disposable syringes.
During their service, some people became infected because we know from independent sources that there are a lot of wounded, many injuries involving, the loss of limbs. And this naturally leads to significant blood loss. So if a person living with HIV who is not receiving treatment and perhaps doesn't even know their status suffers such an injury, it's possible that this infected blood could have been transmitted to others.
The rise in illnesses and deaths from the immunodeficiency virus is also directly linked to the Kremlin, which, under the guise of protecting traditional values, has increased pressure on preventive and educational organizations fighting HIV. The authorities have almost stopped publishing data on HIV. At the same time, the Russian army, which finds itself in prolonged isolation and without access to medical care, has become especially vulnerable.
For example, they started recruiting prisoners with HIV into the army, or more likely, not into the army itself, but into private military companies. Additionally, after the partial mobilization was announced, and especially after they started offering such huge sums for signing a contract, some people with HIV decided to enlist. They chose to hide their HIV status.
Despite statements claiming that HIV-positive individuals are not being sent to fight in the war with Ukraine, in reality, there are at least hundreds of contract soldiers, mobilized troops, and volunteers with this diagnosis on the front lines.
Despite the diagnosis and the medical commission's conclusion of limited fitness, the soldier was transferred to a motorized rifle battalion and later to combat positions.
Conscripts with an HIV diagnosis are not accepted into the army. This disease falls under Category D, which means complete exemption from service.
Yes, indeed, there could have been cases when a person at a certain stage of HIV infection was allowed to continue serving in the army if they were diagnosed while already in service. But at the same time, a person with HIV was not allowed to join the army in the first place. And here too, there was strict control at the entry stage when it was mandatory to provide certificates regarding HIV, about the presence of HIV infection, viral hepatitis, tuberculosis. All these diseases served as grounds for exemption. And again, after the so-called special military operation truly began in earnest, and after it became absolutely necessary to fill the army with many new people, so to speak, to replace those who were unfortunately leaving or had already departed, of course, they started to turn a completely blind eye to this particular situation.
From the very beginning of mobilization in the Russian Federation, HIV-positive Russians have been receiving draft notices and continue to receive them to this day. Military enlistment offices are unaware of their current health status. Some volunteers hide this in order to go to war and earn money, while others simply do not know about their diagnoses. At the same time, the Russian Federation's Ministry of Defense fears reputational losses.
So yes, indeed, we cannot say that the HIV epidemic has been overcome as of today. And unfortunately, I fear that officials from the Ministry of Health simply want to be overly optimistic here.
In 2025, it became known that entire assault battalions were being formed from people with hepatitis and HIV.
Last time, he spent 7 or 8 months there, constantly on the front line. But back then, he didn't have this diagnosis, he had strength, he could run, and so on. It can't be ruled out that now they'll gather everyone with diagnoses and throw them onto the front line.
The situation is so bad that these units, even though they undergo training, the Ministry of Defense intends to dispose of them on the battlefield, regardless of their training or the shortage of people due to losses.
Went through the military enlistment office and they found out I had HIV. They told me to wait for the Central Military Medical Commission for my discharge. Today, the commander said that he is sending me back to the combat zone.
Such a soldier creates a risk at war. The infection could spread among other servicemen. But in addition to this, the Russian occupier creates difficulties in providing medical assistance to the wounded and poses a direct threat to medical personnel who are already scarce on the front lines. By the end of 2024, the number of infection cases in the Russian Federation's army had increased 20-fold. Since 2022, Putin has been intensely focused on the war, and Russia has entered the top 5 countries in the world for new HIV infections, surpassed only by South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria, and India.
For this regime, people are just a resource. For example, they are a resource to wage war. So, on the one hand, they need healthy, strong people in a fascist, you could say, sense. But on the other hand, we also have no idea how many people with HIV have been sent to the combat zone. There are absolutely no statistics on this matter.
How often they inject themselves there every day and how many heroes will come home to have children, we don't know either.
Due to sanctions and lack of funding, a record number of interruptions in antiretroviral therapy medications were reported in 2024. But not only is the Kremlin killing Russians by starving them of necessary medications, it is also putting Ukrainians in the occupied territories at risk. There is no reliable data on what is happening with therapy in the occupied territories. Back in 2022, the UN reported that antiretroviral therapy centers in these territories had been closed. Due to the Kremlin's attitude towards serious diseases, the demographic and economic consequences of the outbreak will be felt for decades and may even prove more devastating than the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine.
In Russia, draft notices are now being issued online. No, don't think this is a story about the occupier country's development. After all, in some Russian villages, it's not just that they have never heard of the internet, they probably haven't even heard of running water.
Putin is afraid to announce a full-scale mobilization because this could be one of the few, or maybe the only reasons that might actually make people take to the streets.
Online draft notices from the Kremlin are all about finding new ways to mobilize more people and send them off to fight.
The issuance of electronic draft notices is primarily about significantly reducing the possibilities for legal appeals against conscription or mobilization, thereby streamlining the process and minimizing potential delays. Because previously a draft notice had to be delivered by hand, and if the conscript didn't actually receive it, the legality of such a draft could be challenged. But now it's enough just to send it through the government services portal, and that automatically means the notice has been delivered.
They send out invitations to join the occupier's army, regardless of whether the conscript is registered in the government services system or not. Whether or not he's in the system is now essentially the conscript's own problem.
Electronic draft notices are sent through the government services portal. So if a person doesn't have an account on the government services portal, they are still supposed to receive the electronic draft notice. Accordingly, there isn't really much data on how many people subject to military service have created such accounts. But apparently this method is extremely useful for the military enlistment officers.
By law, an electronic draft notice is considered delivered 7 days after it is posted in the registry, and the recipient is automatically barred from leaving Russia. If the conscript fails to appear at the military enlistment office on the specified date, additional restrictions are imposed after 20 calendar days. He is prohibited from obtaining a foreign passport, conducting real estate transactions, taking out loans, and registering as self-employed. An administrative fine ranging from 10 to 30,000 rubles may also be imposed on the draft dodger.
Recently, the relevant legislation has been consistently tightening in this particular area. As we already know, the draft has already become continuous and so on and so forth, with many more developments expected. In other words, as we comprehensively understand it, Vladimir Putin is demonstrably running out of available cannon fodder. So more and more increasingly desperate and novel methods are being actively employed to prevent individuals from successfully avoiding being sent to the very front lines of the conflict.
In the summer, Russians began to receive mass notifications through government services about being added to the military registration database with electronic draft notices. In the mass mailing, those liable for military service were asked to log in and obtain a statement about their personal data. This is believed to be related to the possible preparation of a conscript database ahead of the autumn draft.
The Kremlin is doing everything it can to deny that it is using conscripts. It's true that not many conscripts are actually sent, but the thing is, there are many ways to force a conscript to sign a contract, after which he becomes a contract soldier and can be sent to war. Because the Russian army, if it differs from the Soviet one at all, it's mostly for the worse, since a person who ends up there has virtually no rights.
Putin ordered the creation of a unified digital registry of those liable for military service in Russia as early as the first year of the so-called special military operation. By April 2023, electronic draft notices were equated with paper ones and restrictions were imposed on citizens who evade mobilization. This is precisely what is linked to the mass exodus of Russians abroad, which, according to various estimates, numbers up to 1 million people.
That's all from me for now. This was me, Victoria Panchenko. Even more hellish news from the front in our next episode. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you soon.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.